The market was a cacophony of bustling shoppers, shouting vendors, and the occasional bark from tethered dogs waiting by their owners. Among the chaos, 5-year-old Sophie clung tightly to her mother's hand, her eyes wide with wonder as they passed stalls filled with vibrant fruits, handmade trinkets, and fragrant spices. She loved the energy of the market, but today, something else caught her attention. In a shadowy corner near the butcher's stand, a rusty metal cage held a dog. The fur was matted and patchy, the ribs showing beneath the dirt-streaked coat. Most striking were the eyes, dark, sorrowful, and pleading. The dog didn't bark or whimper, it simply stared, its gaze piercing through the bustling crowd as if searching for someone who might care. Sophie stopped dead, pulling on her mother's arm. "Mama, look!" she said, pointing into the cage. Her mother, Claire, turned and frowned. "Oh, honey, that's not a pet. That poor thing." She trailed off, then pulled Sophie gently forward. "Come on, we don't have time." But Sophie dug in her heels. "Mama, he's sad. We have to help him." The dog's former owner, a scruffy man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, noticed Sophie's interest and sauntered over. "That mutt ain't worth your time," he said gruffly. "Bad temper. Won't obey. You're better off with one of them puppies over there." He gestured toward a nearby stall, where fluffy golden retrievers wagged their tails behind clean glass. Sophie ignored him, her small face set with determination. "What's his name?" The man shrugged. "Dunno. Doesn't need one." "Well, take him," Sophie declared, her voice steady. Claire's eyes widened. "Sophie, no. We can't just, Mama, please." Sophie's voice broke and tears welled in her eyes. "He needs us. I'll take care of him, I promise." The vendor leaned back, blowing smoke into the air. "Tell you what. You can have him for $50. But don't come crying to me when he tears up your house." Claire hesitated, glancing between Sophie's imploring face and the miserable creature in the cage. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. But he's your responsibility, Sophie." They brought the dog home that evening. Sophie named him Thor, insisting that a strong name would help him feel brave. The first few days were rough. Thor flinched at sudden movements, growled at strangers, and refused to eat unless Sophie sat beside him. But Sophie's patience was boundless. She spent hours brushing his tangled fur, speaking softly to him, and offering treats with an outstretched hand. "You're safe now," she whispered one night as she stroked his head. "No one's going to hurt you again." Thor's dark eyes seemed to soften, and for the first time, his tail gave a tentative wag. Meanwhile, Claire's skepticism lingered. "That dog is a disaster waiting to happen," she muttered to her husband, Mark, as they watched Thor from the kitchen window. He was in the yard, chasing a ball Sophie had thrown. "Give it time," Mark said. "She's already done more for him than anyone else ever has. Maybe he just needs to learn what love is." "I hope you're right," Claire replied, her tone doubtful. Thor's transformation was gradual. He began to follow Sophie around the house, his jittery energy giving way to cautious curiosity. When she giggled, he perked up. When she cried, he nudged her hand with his nose. The family brought in a professional animal behaviorist, who was astonished by how attuned Sophie seemed to be to Thor. Most dogs with this level of trauma take months, sometimes years, to open up, the behaviorist explained during one session. But he's responding to her almost immediately. It's remarkable. "It's Sophie," Claire admitted, watching her daughter coax Thor through an agility course in the backyard. "She just sees the good in everyone." One crisp autumn morning, everything changed. Sophie and Thor were walking to the park with Claire when suddenly, from behind them, a commotion arose. A car was going at top gear round the bend with its tires screeching. The little girl stood frozen on the middle of the crosswalk, eyes wide towards the oncoming car. "Sophie!" Claire screamed and was too far away for her to get to in time. Thor acted without hesitation. With a powerful leap, he shoved Sophie out of the car's path, taking the brunt of the collision himself. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver stumbled out, pale and trembling. "I didn't see her. I'm so sorry," the driver stammered. Thor lay still on the pavement, breathing shallowly. Sophie was on her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Thor, please don't leave me," she murmured, her small hands cradling his head. Claire called an emergency vet, and within minutes Thor was whisked away to the clinic. The family waited anxiously in the lobby, Sophie clutching Thor's leash as if she would never let go and with it, possibly lose him forever. Hours later, the vet came out, her face cautious but hopeful. "Thor's injuries are serious, but he's a fighter. With proper care, he'll recover." Sophie's face lit up, and she turned to her parents. "I told you he's strong. He's Thor." Claire knelt beside her, tears in her own eyes. "You were right, sweetheart. He's a hero." Thor recovered slowly but surely. The whole community was moved by his act of bravery, and donations to help pay his medical bills poured in. People he had never met wrote to him, offering words of encouragement. The story of Thor's heroics spread, and he became known as the guardian of the Crosswalk. Yet just when life seemed to be settling into a pleasant routine, a new menace materialized: Thor's previous owner. "That dog's mine," the man growled when he showed up at their door one evening. "You had no right to take him." Mark stepped forward, his voice low and even. "You sold him to us. You abandoned him." The man's sneer deepened. "I didn't know he'd turn into some kind of hero. That mutt's worth something now, and I want him back." Sophie clutched Thor's collar, her small frame trembling. "You can't have him," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "He's my family." The man laughed, a cruel sound that sent a chill through the room. "We'll see what the law has to say about that." The threat had dissipated with the man long since had stormed away, but its effect lingered in this family. Claire paced up and down in the living room, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. Mark leaned against the counter in the kitchen, setting his jaw quietly. Sophie sat on the floor next to Thor, her fingers running through his fur as if reassuring herself that he was there. "What do we do now?" Claire asked, breaking the silence. "Can he really take Thor from us?" Mark exhaled slowly. "Not if we can prove he neglected him. We've got photos from the market, vet records, and witnesses who can testify to his condition when we got him." "But what if that's not enough?" Claire pressed. "What if he's able to twist things in his favor?" Sophie looked up, her voice small yet determined. "Thor belongs with us. We can't let him go back to that man." Mark knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We want Kiddo. I promise." The following morning, the family started collecting evidence. Claire called up the vet, who agreed to forward detailed records of Thor when he first came in, documenting his malnourishment and neglect. Mark got in touch with vendors at the market, many of whom recalled seeing Thor in his cage and were willing to offer statements. Even Sophie added her contribution, drawing pictures showing Thor's transformation and penning a letter about just how much he meant to her. "Every little bit helps," Mark assured her as he added her drawings to the growing pile of evidence. They also hired an attorney, a kind woman named Ellen who specializes in animal welfare cases. After hearing the family's story, Ellen agreed to take the case on free of charge. "It isn't just about Thor," Ellen explained at their first meeting. "It's about setting a precedent. If we can prove this man was abusive and unfit to own an animal, it could prevent it from happening to other animals in the future." Days turned into weeks as the legal battle loomed closer. Meanwhile, the community's support for Thor and the family grew stronger. Neighbors stopped by with words of encouragement, and strangers sent messages of support after hearing about Thor's story through local news coverage. Sophie's teacher even organized a fundraiser at school, with proceeds going toward Thor's legal defense and recovery. Despite the outpouring of support, tensions ran high in the Walker household. The man who they learned was named Hank began showing up at odd hours, standing on the sidewalk across from their house and glaring at the windows. Once, they caught him taking pictures of Thor through the fence. "He's trying to intimidate us," Mark said one evening as he installed a new security camera on the porch. "But we're not backing down." Thor seemed to sense the family's unease. He stuck closer to Sophie than ever, his protective instincts sharpening with each passing day. One afternoon, when Hank approached the house and rattled the gate, Thor let out a bark so fierce that Hank stumbled backward and nearly fell. "Good boy," Mark said, patting Thor's head as he watched Hank retreat down the street. Finally, the day of the hearing had arrived. The family put on the best clothes and went to the courthouse, their nerves on edge but their resolve unshaken. Thor wasn't allowed inside, so Claire stayed with him in the car while Mark and Sophie entered with Ellen. The courtroom held a degree of tension mixed with formality. On one side, Hank sat with a greasy-looking attorney who, like his client, wasn't the least bit nice. On the other side sat Ellen, who presented calm professionalism for the Walker family. "Thor was in a state of severe neglect when my clients found him," Ellen said, flashing pictures of Thor from the day he was rescued. "He was malnourished, covered in sores, and emotionally traumatized. The defendant made no effort to care for him, as evidenced by witness statements and veterinary records." Hank's lawyer scoffed. "The dog was fine. He's a mutt, you don't need to treat them like royalty. My client only sold him because these people insisted on taking him." Ellen's eyes narrowed. "The law requires basic care and humane treatment for all animals, regardless of breed. Thor was well below those standards, and my clients have worked around the clock to rehabilitate him. Returning him to the defendant would be not only cruel but dangerous." The judge was a stern-looking woman with glasses balanced on the end of her nose as she listened intently to both sides. Then Sophie took the stand, her small hands clenching onto the edge of the witness box as she spoke. "Thor is my best friend," she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing with each word. "He was scared when we first got him, but now he's happy. He's brave, and he saved my life. Please don't make him go back to that bad man." There was a silence in the courtroom as Sophie stepped down, her words hanging in the air like a plea to the very soul of justice. After hours of deliberation, the judge had reached her verdict. "It's pretty evident from the evidence that, at a minimum, this was neglect of this animal by the defendant. Additionally, the Walker family has proven to be not only capable of providing the care needed by Thor but also the special bond between them and Thor. The application for custody of Thor is hereby granted to remain with the Walkers." Sophie let out a small cry of joy, throwing her arms around Mark's waist. Ellen smiled triumphantly, shaking hands with Claire as they joined her and Thor outside the courthouse. "You did it," Ellen said, crouching to pet Thor. "You're a free dog now, buddy." Thor wagged his tail, his eyes shining with what could only be described as gratitude. But that wasn't the end of it. During the course of proceedings, Ellen learned of evidence showing that Hank had a history of cruelty toward animals. Eventually, local advocates were able to build charges against him in his actions, and thus he opened an investigation, discovering illegal and inhumane selling networks. The fall of Hank was swift and ignominious. There were rallies and petitions to make laws that can protect animals. Sophie, hailed as a local hero now, was invited to all events to share Thor's story and inspire others to rise for the voiceless. She was home at last with Thor, who through the process had become totally rehabilitated, no longer that frightened, unloved dog from the market but a symbol of strength and loyalty, the unbroken bond between a girl and her dog. Life slowly started to find its rhythm again after victory in the courtroom. Thor completely fitted into his new life. He was a member of the Walker family. Confident, the once terrified dog now moved his tail more often. He stopped flinching at sudden noises or strangers and became even closer to Sophie. Still, his journey was only halfway through, and soon his story would take a wholly unexpected turn. One sunny Saturday morning, the Walker family decided to attend a local community event at the park. It was a fundraiser for animal shelters, inspired by Thor's story. The park buzzed with activity. Booths selling homemade crafts, food trucks serving treats, and a makeshift stage where speakers shared heartwarming tales of rescued animals. Sophie and Thor were inseparable, as they always were. She proudly held his leash, guiding him through the crowd while people stopped to admire him. Some recognized him from the news and asked for photos, which Sophie gladly obliged. "Thor's famous now," Mark teased, ruffling Sophie's hair. He might need a bodyguard soon. Thor barked once, as if in agreement, drawing laughter from the group. The family was enjoying the festivities when suddenly, a commotion arose at one of the booths. There were screams of alarm as the attention of everyone in the park was caught. Some disheveled man was in a frenzy and had grabbed a woman's purse. He was running towards the edge of the park. "Stop him!" someone yelled, but the crowd froze in confusion, unsure what to do. Thor didn't hesitate. Thoroughly catching everyone off guard, he took off after the thief, pulling Sophie along. "Thor, wait!" Sophie yelled, hurrying to keep up as her dog forged ahead with a supersonic burst of speed. Mark and Claire ran after them, hearts pounding. The crowd parted as Thor closed in on the man, who glanced over his shoulder and stumbled in surprise at the sight of the determined dog bearing down on him. "Get away, you stupid mutt!" the thief yelled, but Thor was undeterred. He leaped at the man in a way that was almost heroic, his powerful jaws clamping onto the thief's sleeve. The purse fell to the ground as the man struggled to free himself, but Thor held tight, growling low and steady. By the time Mark and a few other bystanders reached the scene, the thief had given up, lying flat on the grass with his hands raised. All right. Call off the dog," he pleaded. Mark pulled Thor back, praising him as the crowd erupted into cheers. Sophie threw her arms around Thor's neck, her eyes shining with pride. "You're amazing, Thor!" she whispered. Soon the police had him in custody. Then an emotionally distraught lady in her 50s, purse securely held, came up and tearfully thanked the walkers. "Thank you," she said, stroking Thor's head. "I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost everything in that bag." "He's a hero," Sophie beamed. "He's always been a hero." News of Thor's bravery spread in a whirl. The local paper did a front-page story headlined, "Rescue Dog Turns Hero, Thor Saves the Day at Park Fundraiser." The story underlined his saga from neglect to redemption and highlighted the love and care on which his diamond in the rough was shined into brilliance. It also drew more positive change. The donations to the local shelters increased, and they started building new facilities and saving more animals. Sophie's school invited her to tell Thor's story during an assembly, during which she spoke confidently of the importance of kindness and giving second chances. "Thor taught me that everyone needs love, even though they may have been hurt before," she told the audience. "Sometimes, all it takes is one person to believe in you to make a difference." Her words earned a standing ovation, and Thor's wagging tail stole the show. With the new fame and community support, the walkers began to notice a subtle yet significant change in Thor. He seemed to walk taller, his head held high as though he understood his role as a symbol of hope. He no longer shied away from crowds or loud noises. Instead, he met new challenges with the same courage he had shown at the park. The transformation even cast a ripple on Thor's former owner, Hank. He faced charges for his past acts of animal cruelty. A case that became an example to many in the community as animal welfare groups used Thor's story to push for stronger protection and harsher penalties in the case of neglect or abuse. One evening, as the family was sitting in the backyard, Sophie turned to her parents with a reflective look on her face. "Do you think Thor knows how much he's changed?" she asked. Mark smiled, tossing a ball for Thor to fetch. "I think he knows, sophomore. But more importantly, I think he knows how much he's loved." Thor returned with the ball, dropping it at Sophie's feet before sitting proudly beside her. She wrapped her arms around him, her face buried in his fur. "You're the best dog in the world, Thor," she whispered. "And I'll always believe in you." Thor licked her cheek, his tail thumping in agreement against the ground. Their bond was unbreakable, forged through challenges, love, and a shared determination to prove that even the most broken spirits could rise again. In the weeks following Thor's heroic actions, life seemed brighter for the walkers and their community. The once overlooked dog had become a local celebrity, and his story resonated far beyond their small town. Strangers sent letters and gifts, thanking the family for rescuing Thor and sharing their own tales of love and redemption with their pets. Despite the attention, the walkers remained grounded, focusing on what mattered most: their bond with Thor. But Thor, however, took his new role as a hero seriously. He patrolled the yard with a newfound sense of purpose, greeting neighbors with his wagging tail while keeping a watchful eye on Sophie. The change in him was unmistakable. Where once dark, sorrowful eyes stared out, now sparkled with life, and the once timid Thor was replaced with unshakable confidence. But not all was smooth sailing along Thor's journey. One overcast afternoon, Sophie and her parents went to visit the animal shelter that had inspired the fundraiser. They took Thor with them, wanting to show the other animals what love and care could do. As they entered, the familiar sounds of barking and meowing filled the air, and Thor's ears perked up. Sophie knelt beside him, scratching his head. "You were just like them once," she whispered. "But now you're here to help." The shelter staff greeted the family warmly, and the director, a kind woman named Susan, led them on a tour. She stopped at one particular kennel, where a scrappy, trembling dog huddled in the corner. "This is Daisy," Susan said. "She was rescued from a neglectful home last month. She's been struggling to trust people." The sight of Daisy made Sophie's heart ache. She turned to Thor, who was acting like he sensed the little dog's fear. He slowly walked toward her kennel, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat down outside the door, his tail wagging in slow motion. Daisy's trembling began to subside as she watched him, her eyes peeking out curiously from the tangles of fur. "He's amazing," Susan said, wonder leading her voice. "I have never seen Daisy respond to anyone that way." Sophie smiled. "Thor knows how she feels. He'll help her." The visit to the shelter sparked a new idea for the walkers, and they felt inspired by Thor's transformation, a program that matched children like Sophie with rescue dogs in dire need of socialization and companionship. They labeled it Second Chances, and applications poured in. Families signed up from everywhere, wanting to take part in this initiative. Thor became the ambassador of the program, attending events and demonstrations where he showed off his agility skills and gentle nature. Sophie was often by his side, sharing their story and encouraging others to open their hearts to rescue animals. "Thor taught me that love can change everything," she would say. "If you just give someone a chance, they can become a hero too." As Second Chances grew, so did Thor's impact. The program partnered with local schools to teach children about empathy and responsibility. Dogs that were once considered unadoptable found homes, inspired by Thor's example. Not everyone was pleased with the changes, however. Hank, Thor's previous owner, had been released on probation and was quite vocal about his disapproval of the program. He would constantly make caustic remarks to the press about how the walkers were using Thor for publicity. "They took my dog and turned him into some kind of circus act," he sneered during one interview. "They're just using him to make themselves look good." When he had spoken thus, Sophie was not deterred. "He doesn't understand Thor," she said to her parents. "Thor isn't a tool. He's family." Thor was no more impressed with the comments of Hank. During a community event, when Hank tried to confront the walkers, Thor stared him down, his serene but firm gaze saying it all: "You are nothing here." The huffy retreat of Hank was drowned out by the cheering of the crowd. The months soon became years, and the legacy of Thor continued unabated. By the time Sophie turned 8, Second Chances had spread to include the neighboring towns, where hundreds of animals had already been saved through the program. Thor was a legend, spending his days visiting schools, shelters, and even hospitals wherever his comforting, inspirational presence was desired. As a gentle snow fell outside, Sophie sat by the fireplace that winter evening, Thor curled at her feet. She ran her fingers through his gold fur as her mind wandered to that day she had first spotted him at the market. "You changed everything, Thor," she said in quiet tones. "Not just for me, but for so many others too." Thor opened one eye, and his tail went thump, thump against the floor. He must have known, somehow, how much further they had gone together. Claire and Mark joined them by the fire, carrying mugs of steaming hot cocoa. "What are you thinking, Soph?" Mark asked, sitting down beside her. "How lucky we are," Sophie replied, smiling at her parents. "And how lucky Thor is too." Claire leaned over and scratched Thor behind the ears. "He's more than lucky. He's special. And so are you for seeing that in him. The family sat together, the warmth of the fire and their bond filling the room with a sense of peace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. Thor stretched out with a contented sigh, his journey from despair to joy complete.